Good evening. I'm delighted that you were able to join this webinar. As you know, this is one of a series of webinars about the future of the island of Ireland. We host a number of speakers representing different views about how Ireland should organize itself over the next few years, especially with reference to the big issue of whether or not should be unified again with the South or whether it should stay part of the United Kingdom. We are particularly thankful to Sidney Sussex College and to the Center for Geopolitics for hosting this seminar. And without further ado, let me introduce my co-host and co-convener, Barry. Over to you, Barry.
Thank you, Professor. Good evening, everybody, as always in Europe, and good afternoon to friends in North America. I'm really thrilled to be welcoming you to this, what is our 8th meeting of the Cambridge Seminar on the Future of the Island of Ireland. And our speaker this evening is Hugo MacNeill, who I'll introduce in a moment. But just to remind you, in the coming weeks, next Monday at the same time, we're delighted to host Bertie Ahern, former Taoiseach of Ireland. Following week, so this is the 25th of October, we're delighted to host Eileen Weir from the Shankill Women's Centre, speak about her experiences working on the grassroots in Belfast. And following that, we'll have Lord Robin Eames, amongst others. But just please keep an eye on our series and our website because there's some interesting speakers lined up. Tonight, Hugo is going to speak on the topic of reconciliation and mutual trust, the crucially unfinished elements of the Good Friday Agreement. Hugo MacNeill will be known to many of you. He's been involved in North-South and British-Irish relations all his adult life in different ways, having been involved with the British-Irish Association for more than the past 2 decades and chairman since 2013. And Hugo has been on the board of the Ireland Fund of Great Britain and chairman of the Ireland Fund in Dublin. Hugo is a former Irish Rugby International. And in 1996, after the Canary Wharf bombing, he, together with his former teammate Trevor Ringland, organised the Peace International Initiative, which brought a team of the world's best rugby players to Dublin to play Ireland as a message of solidarity to all who were working for peace in Ireland. This is something I think Hugo might unpack a little bit during his presentation, something that's really interesting from his recent past. The guests of honour at this event were children whose lives were tragically affected by the loss of parents and siblings. Hugo has done this alongside a career in international business, which has involved working with many of Ireland's leading companies. So tonight, Hugo is going to be in discussion both with Professor B. Genie and to a lesser degree myself. And as always, the conversation will be followed by questions and answers, one of the most important parts of the evening. So without further ado, I hand you over to Hugo. Hugo, thanks for being with us, and you have 10, 12 minutes.
Great. Firstly, can I say a big thank you to Barry and to Eugenio for both organising this wonderful series of events, and I've managed to get to most of them and really enjoyed them, and thank you for hosting me this evening. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining. There's been much talk recently about the topic of a border poll and Irish unity, and specific discussion has been held in this lecture series on the same topic, as Eugenio has outlined. Reference in these discussions is always made to the Good Friday Agreement, and the specific point on page 4 of that agreement of relating to the ability of the Secretary of State to direct a border poll be held on the issue. Much less attention, and frequently none at all, is given to topics that are raised at the absolute beginning of the document, and I would argue are absolutely crucial. On page 2 of the Good Friday Agreement, it reads, "We firmly dedicate ourselves to the achievement of reconciliation, tolerance, and mutual trust, and the protection and vindication of human rights of all." On page 3 of the agreement, we will endeavour to strive in every practical way towards reconciliation and rapprochement. Topics such as reconciliation and tolerance are seen as rather soft topics, kind of nice to have, rather than need to have. I firmly believe that in this context, and given the very specific and painful history of Northern Ireland, they are anything but that. True reconciliation and tolerance remain crucially unfinished parts of the Belfast Agreement. I will contend in this short address that they are absolute requirements, not only for a Northern Ireland or North that works for the majority of its citizens today, with specific acknowledgement of the growing number of citizens who are not defining themselves in the traditional binary way. They are also, however, and this is central, the essential requirements for a Northern Ireland or North, which reflect the longer term ambitions of both the major traditions, either a united Ireland or a Northern Ireland remaining in the United Kingdom. And why is this? It's highly questionable, I believe, whether the Republic would vote for unity with a Northern Ireland that was not at peace with itself, reflecting much greater levels of reconciliation and tolerance than are evident today. I would also argue that from the Unionist perspective, a reconciled Northern Ireland is likely to engender a much more positive view from the rest of the United Kingdom than exists at this present day. Firstly, the aspiration towards a united Ireland is an entirely legitimate one. Many have held it for a long time and consider it as a genuine dream to be realized. Many nationalists in the North had to endure a lack of civil rights for a long time and felt abandoned by the Republic. Even though they have been largely addressed, although issues such as Irish language rights can prove divisive today, and have seen a considerable passage of time, the effects of what they saw as a lack of respect can still be seen. Now, at the same time, many attitudes in the Republic towards Northern Ireland remain highly simplistic. Many travel north rarely, if at all, unless they are based in the border regions. The history that we are taught at school in the Republic is the story of the journey with all its ups and downs to being an independent Ireland. Independent in this context meant not British. Now, therefore, it's sometimes genuinely hard for people in the Republic of Ireland to appreciate what it means to be British and Irish at the same time. Now, the channel BT Sport made a documentary on how rugby brought people together on this island, irrespective of their political constitutional allegiances. Two recent captains and former Irish teammates and British and Irish Lions players, Brian O'Driscoll from Dublin and Rory Best from Ulster, were talking, and Brian expressed his confusion. Hi, Rory, I don't get it. You play for Ireland, and yet you're British at the same time. Yes, I am, said Rory. And Brian wasn't trying to be in any way seeking to be provocative or cause offense. Now, why I mention this is that I would respectfully suggest that this attitude reflects many of those in the Republic who have real difficulty understanding the concept of being genuinely British and genuinely Irish at the same time. It echoes the well-known point emphasized by Ulster poet John Hewitt when expressing the various components of his identity, all of which were important. I always maintained that our loyalties added an order to, he said, to Ulster, to Ireland, to the British archipelago, to Europe, and that anyone who skipped a step or missed a link falsified the total. They were not describing him. They were not describing the totality of his identities, an identity that is reflected in many on the island today. There is still relatively little understanding or real discussion in the Republic of the key issues, both emotionally and practically for Ulster Unionists. There has been some just touching on this subject in this series, but I would argue it has to be much more. More importantly, and this is crucial, there is little real engagement on these topics. Despite the claims of some groups that everything is up for discussion, there's a lot of discussion happening, but little generosity of spirit has yet been seen. So what are the issues? Issues such as rejoining the Commonwealth, the importance of the British monarchy, a meaningful role for Stormont, a new flag and constitution, the NHS, the song, July the 12th, and so on and so on. Every year at the start of the rugby season, there are letters to the papers complaining about the singing of Ireland's Call, an anthem specifically designed to reflect all the identities on this island, given that rugby and a number of other sports are played on an all-island basis without threatening anybody's identity. Some have even claimed that this anthem, as opposed to our own Naveen, the anthem of the Republic, has had a dispiriting effect on the Irish team, until it's pointed out to them that the two most successful countries in the history of world rugby had both adapted to their anthems to reflect the different compositions of their national team. And if you're having problems with Ireland's Call, as many people obviously are, wait till you get onto the real issues involved. Now, at the same time, I would respectfully suggest that there is a need for unionists to develop a more constructive and inclusive unionism. This is both necessary for a united Northern Ireland that works better for all its citizens, but also to engender a more positive attitude from the rest of the United Kingdom. Having lived in England for almost 20 years until 2000 and been involved in British-Irish affairs since then, I have seen many examples of this detachment. Who has, at the same time, been providing a positive, inclusive vision of Northern Ireland to the rest of the United Kingdom? Anthony Kenny, who was the former Master of Balliol College, Oxford, and one of the founders of the British-Irish Association, made an observation back in the 1970s that I believe still remains of relevance today. What used to bind Britain to Northern Ireland were three things, he said: sentiment, self-interest, morality. Sentiment, we hold an affection for the place and feel a connection to its people. Self-interest, it used to be a practical use, going way back to the northern ports in World War II. Morality, we did not submit to Nazi bombardments, and neither will we do the same in response to IRA violence. He said that now, i.e. back in the 1970s, only the last of these applied. Comments from leading politicians, UK politicians over the period, and some in recent times, have only heightened unionist concerns about British attitudes. And this is all set in the context of potential shifts in the UK itself. I recall some years ago being at a British-Irish Association committee meeting where certain Welsh and Scottish issues were being discussed at length. A senior English former diplomat shook their head. "This is getting all very tiresome," was the comment. I remember turning to my right to the chairman of the BIA, Conor Brady, and saying the sleeping giant of English nationalism is awakening. A trend we have only seen increase since then. This is not good for Ulster unionism. Ulster unionists deserve better than this, but at the same time, they have to have more constructive and inclusive leadership, I would respect. Taoiseach Micheál Martin has shown a consistent commitment to an understanding of Northern Ireland issues over a long political career. He has talked about going there frequently and the value and understanding gained by talking to people after the formal meetings, a point that made recently in recent years by Simon Coveney in his travels north. We understand this very clearly from our experience with the British-Irish Association, where the main benefits are often gained in informal discussions outside the set-piece events of our annual conference. Now, in addition to the BIA, I would consider myself very lucky that playing rugby brought me to Northern Ireland on increasingly regular occasions from my early 20s. Up till then, I really had not only met people from a nationalist background, but now this was hugely amplified, going to places like Ballymena, Belfast, Bangor, Dungannon, Derry, Londonderry, and many more locations. Rugby was and is mostly played by people of a unionist background. People used to say at the time it was great the way you all played on the Irish team, and the issue of the Troubles was never mentioned. Well, I thought that, that was fine as far as it went, but not very far, because if you had got to know and respect a teammate and a friend in the intense atmosphere of international rugby, and you could not then sit down and explore and question and ask them about what was important to them, how could you expect young people from polarized communities to do the same? So we talked and we talked. And principally with my great friend Trevor Ringland, who is also an Irish international and who's had a similar period over the last number of years in working at various organizations to promote peace and reconciliation, and was recently announced as a special envoy for the UK to the United States. And he and I talked and we still do to this day. And so after the Canary Wharf bombing in 1996, I, together with Trevor, as Barry mentioned, organised the Peace International. And what was this? This was designed to bring together many of the best players in the world to play Ireland in a team captained by Francois Pienaar as a statement against all terrorist violence. Now, Francois had captained South Africa to winning the World Cup the previous year in 1995. And his image with President Nelson Mandela wearing a South African jersey, long seen as a symbol of apartheid, had gone around the world. And for that match, we filled what was then Lansdowne Road, now the Aviva Stadium. And the guests of honor were all children whose lives, as Barry mentioned, have been dramatically impacted by terrorist violence. Darren Baird, who lost both his parents and sister in the IRA bombing of the Shankill Road Fish and Chip Shop. Tommy Mullen next to him, whose brother was killed in the UVF attack on the Rising Sun pub in Greysteel a week later. And Gareth Bolesworth, whose best friend Tim Parry was killed in the IRA bombing of Warrington in England. It was an incredibly emotional event, and I've had many days of great rugby events in that stadium, but nothing came close to the scene at the end of the match where these players who had created some of the greatest images in world rugby did a lap of honor, and the whole crowd stood and applauded and thanked them for bringing their credibility to those who were working for peace in Ireland. And many supporters, as I said, who had never been Lansdowne Road before, came to the game. So what do we need to do? We need to build mutual respect and understanding without threatening anyone's sense of identity. So how practically can that be done? It's nice words. So we need to maximize the potential of bodies such as the North-South Ministerial Council and the British-Irish Council. I believe the Shared Island Initiative in the Department of the Taoiseach has genuine aspirations and real potential. This is despite its difficulties in having real interpersonal contacts due to COVID, and also the refusal of some unionists to engage, given other issues such as the Northern Ireland Protocol. Civic groups such as Cooperation Ireland, the Ireland Funds, and the BIA are important and can expand their activities. There is a role for real citizens' assemblies. Much greater progress needs to be made on integrated education, which remains stubbornly low. And then around 7% is around about the level it was, as I recall, when I first got involved in Northern Ireland affairs. There is a real focus on working class areas where the prospects of many are actually few. I would also highlight on a positive note, a recent victory for Northern Ireland in Belfast being chosen as the host city for One Young World in 2023. Now, for those who are not familiar with it, One Young World is the world's largest annual gathering of over 2,000 young social activists, and is the only event, apart from the Olympic Games, where there are representatives from every country in the world. Now, why was Belfast chosen? And the reasons are particularly strong, but shows the potential. Belfast was chosen in a very competitive process because, quote, of the warmth of its welcome, its history, its resilience, and its humor. Northern Ireland has always been a huge part of my life. I love the place and its people, all its people, to those who call it Northern Ireland or the North. To achieve true reconciliation and tolerance, we need civic and political leadership. We need who on the nationalist side is consistently, and I mean consistently, reaching out to unionists with a positive and inclusive vision of the future. And who on the unionist side is consistently doing the same with nationalists. We are seeing the growth of the middle ground who increasingly do not want to be labeled in this way. True reconciliation and mutual respect, I would say in conclusion, will build a Northern Ireland that works better for all its citizens. It is also the absolute requirement for the longer term and constitutional ambitions for both major traditions. This is a big prize for everyone, a prize worth going for. Thank you very much for your attention tonight.
Thanks very much, Hugo. Without further ado, Eugenio.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you, Hugo. I must say I agree with everything you said, but I'm also glad that you started and you delved on rugby because it works, unlike politics. And in fact, rugby is one of the few areas, perhaps the only one, in which emotions and reason go together, at least in Northern Irish affairs, going to in the same direction. And this is why it's such a good source of examples. And the problem is that in politics, it seems that emotions always wins out over reason. There was an article in The Guardian today, actually, along these lines, as a general trend in modern British politics. And certainly since Brexit, this has become more noticeable in Northern Irish, in the relations between Northern Ireland and the rest, and within Northern Ireland, in the relations between the unionist parties, especially the DUP and Sinn Féin. And of course, the question would be, why are these two groups so ossified on positions which are ultimately self-defeating? And the answer is probably that their party interests go against, effectively, the goals which are described so effectively and so beautifully. It is reconciliation, toleration, understanding, finding a way in which respect can be built without threatening identity and furthering instead reciprocal understanding, not to mention, of course, issues such as the integrated education, which has been such a bone of contention for generations. So the problem is precisely that what we should be doing is like the epistle of Paul to the Romans. What we should be doing, we don't do, and we do what we should not be doing. Although this should convict us of sin, in fact, people don't seem to be convicted at all. And in fact, they keep winning elections by riding the old, tired, or political battle cries. So I could go on and on these issues, but the one question on which I would like to conclude is, how can we persuade the two parties which are doing so well? Now the Sinn Féin is also doing very well in the South, to change tack at a stage when their self-interest seems to suggest that they shouldn't. And the other question, which is more historical in a way, especially or biographical perhaps, with your experience as a leading figure within the BIA, how do you see, how have you seen the relations and attitudes to these issues evolving among participants over the years when you presided over the BIA?
Yeah, thanks, Eugenio. I mean, I think the issue of relationships is central, and you talk about the growth of the strength of the two main parties in Northern Ireland. So you're saying a tactic that has been rewarded. It's been very interesting on some of the recent polls to see the growth of the middle ground and to see how that's been shifting in some ways. But I think the point I was trying to make, the more I thought about this, and this is something that has struck me over the years, and it's why that if you don't have reconciliation and if you don't have tolerance, it's really going to preclude you from getting the ultimate sort of the longer term constitutional position that you want. And that's particularly most clearly in the case of the United Ireland. If you not have a reconciled or tolerant North, it's not going to happen, never mind just from the reaction of the Republic, I would contend, but also whatever the reaction from unionism. And I'm not one of those who goes and threatens kind of violence as a reason why one shouldn't explore all these issues. But the point is a different one. If I'm a nationalist advocating for a united Ireland, if you don't create those conditions at first, it's going to be very difficult. There's no use talking just about reconciliation. It's a little bit like the guy who says, I want to go and I'm going to win an Olympic medal, a gold medal. It's, how hard are you going to train? Oh, I'm not going to train at all. I'm just going to talk about how keen I am to win the medal, and I'm really going to win that medal. And so I think that's why my point of making of not only was this good in itself, but paradoxically it was the aim. It reflected the only way to achieve the longer term aspirations of both. I mean, I've seen, how have we seen this kind of develop? I mean, if anything, and through the BIA over the period in which it's being set up, I mean, there's been a lot of change that we've certainly seen, certainly relationships within these islands. I would say at the current time, I don't think relations have been as challenged, both between Britain and Ireland. I mean, it was a few years ago after the Queen's visit to Ireland and the President Michael D. Higgins' visit to the United Kingdom, that you couldn't go to a single British-Irish event, whether it was a Chamber of Commerce, whether it was a BIA, whether it was whatever it was, and the person speaking would say, British-Irish relations have never been as good as they were. That's not the case now. And that's not been the case for the last few years. And actually Brexit has been, and we've been seeing the kind of interactions in the past couple of days between Lord Frost and Simon Coveney. It continues to be very divisive. And then relations within the Northern Ireland are fractured, and North-South relations, they're not meeting. The Shared Island Initiative, I think, was a genuine attempt. It wasn't a stalking horse towards the United Ireland. It was actually actually focused on areas that are mutual benefit to everybody. But we need generosity of spirit, and that's why even thinking about someone like President Mandela, who was one of the was just this generosity of spirit, reach out, we can build a better place for everybody. But we have to have kind of generosity of spirit. And I would think that relations are very tough across the crucial north-south, east-west, and within the Northern Ireland than we've seen for some time.
May I come back very briefly, Barry? Barry?
Please, yes, sir. I was just unmuting. Please, we have a good bit of time, Eugenio, so we can
Yes.
fire ahead with 3 or 4 more if you wish. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, that is, of course, what many of us in Britain at any rate, and I'm sure in Ireland as well, both North and South, we regard as a totally sensible set of propositions. But of course, I could play the devil's advocate, and I think I will find a ready audience in Northern Ireland within Sinn Féin, both Sinn Féin and the UP, and say that the much better and effective strategy in the long term has been the zero-sum game. So from a Sinn Féin point of view, you can say the demographics of Northern Ireland illustrate there is an inexorable trend for the nationalist population to overcome numerically the unionist one. So it's just a question of pushing hard as they've done in the past, and eventually the Republic will be forced to take them in. From a unionist point of view, you could say the whole sense of Brexit is an all or nothing strategy. We want a hard border, and we've nearly got it. So why should we relent at this stage? It's much more sensible to push ahead, and indeed, whatever the consequences, we shall impose these consequences on Britain as well as on Ireland. How would you respond to these two rather, well, harsh positions which I've outlined?
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly in the case of Sinn Féin, you'd certainly, the strength continues. But if you look at the recent polls from the DUP and the, their position, it's not been sort of rewarded, and there's sort of confusion within unionism and splitting of the vote. And that's so you're right, Eugenio, but there's a lot of confusion in unionism, and I don't think it's been rewarded. But I sort of come back to the point, even if the simple numerical advantage or population, or you get to a certain extent, that's not necessarily I mean, I would have a lot of listening to a lot of what the late Seamus Mallon had said, and saying, in his talk about the shared home place, he aspired to a united Ireland. He made no claims about it, but he, again, like John Hume, wanted to unite the people first, and wanted to, John and Seamus Mallon, he went through all the funerals of people murdered by terrorist violence. He was sometimes told to get away. He wasn't welcome. More often, he was told, "Thank you for coming." And so his focus was on that it's not just the numerical, but you've got to, and I know there was problems with it not just being 50% plus one in terms of any poll, but more importantly, I think, was what he emphasized was you need to share the place, to create a shared home place, to understand the difference, to try and have this tolerance and reconciliation. Because if you didn't have that, it wasn't going to happen. And my point also about that, the Republic has not really, the South has not really confronted what would be involved, in a united Ireland, and what sacrifices would have to be made in that term. And frequently a lot of the discussions, it's just all about, oh well, it's 50% plus one. What do we need to do apart from tinkering at the edges? Now, there was some interesting conversations earlier in the series that you've had with Jim O'Callaghan in Richmond, talked about it. But mostly when you talk to people in the Republic, there's a sort of sense of it kind of an inevitable, sometimes there's, oh well, this will happen and we don't really have to do anything. But those who really engage with it are saying, this is not necessarily a very easy situation. We have to make genuine compromises, and but it's still at a very, I would argue, a very simplistic level. A lot of the discussion that you frequently see in the Republic towards it. It's not that there shouldn't be an aspiration. It's a perfectly legitimate aspiration by peaceful means. But you have to see, you have to create the conditions in which it's likely to be successful. And that is going to mean a lot more compromise, a lot more generosity of spirit than we've seen to date.
again, I totally agree with what you said. But when I see how people in the South responded to the president deciding not to attend this service, no, without entering into the question and into the question whether or not they should have done so, which is not my business, of course. But what matters is that the way people respond seems to indicate that they are pleased that they didn't, because this was a way to defy the Northern Irish commemoration of the foundation of the state, or the foundation of the province as an independent, self-governing polity. So it's not the case that, once again, reason is defied by emotions, even in the South.
You're absolutely right. And without getting into the specifics, I am pleased to see the government is going to send its representation to be there, and respect the role of the president, who has done a lot for the furthering of dialogue. But by making that decision, it was inevitable that a lot of people within Northern Unionism and moderate Unionism were actually very disappointed, in that. And it goes back to the point that I made, is that I don't think when you ask people in the Republic, would you like a united Ireland? Yeah, it's fine. What exactly are you going to compromise? What do we give up? Do we rejoin the Commonwealth? Do you split the role of Stormont? How's the representation of the unionist side? The NHS, the economic sort of factors. And I think a lot of the discussion around it has been very simplistic, which is why the series that you've convened and organized is so important, because you have confronted some of those issues. But it's a kind of a question of sort of like the Commonwealth. I mean, sometimes when Northern people say, will we join the Commonwealth? Well, if someone said to me, I've got a lot of respect for the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, in its history, is it something that I would in itself like to rejoin? Well, I respect it, but I don't have an aspiration. But at the same time, if someone says if I wanted a united Ireland, would you compromise on that? Well, then I think you've got to look and see, if you want to change the constitutional position, there has to be give and take on both sides. And I don't think that there is a lot of, and even from people who would be sort of decided as moderate when put to the position, what are we going to actually compromise to change the constitutional way in a way that isn't threatening to everyone, is a way that is respectful and is inclusive? You sometimes come up with not very great answers.
Thank you. Perhaps, Barry, we should now open the discussion to the floor, so to speak, because we've seen so many questions coming up.
Absolutely. No, we're spoiled here. Hugo, just to say that I really enjoy listening to you. I enjoy speaking with you as well. I want to ask one or two little things before going to, we have time, before going to the questions and answers. I'm a political scientist, which I always think neatly complements Professor Eugenio. And in your intervention, you spoke specifically about a meaningful role for Stormont. And this is something that really interests me, and it's something that many of our previous guests have spoken about. You touched upon it in your intervention, so brush it aside if you've nothing further to say. But I'm really interested. I know yourself, you're aspiring to office. So do you have anything to say about what future Stormont might look like? I then have a little question about your other great passion in life, which is rugby, but I'll hold that for a second, and then we'll go to the Q&A after. Hugo.
Yeah, I'd make this the general point, Barry. It's the entirely right question on the specific. If we are serious, if you are serious about changing the arrangements on the island, you have to have real compromise on both sides, but not just compromise, engagement and inclusion. And that would be, I would absolutely say, a role for Stormont. What precisely that role is, I don't know. That would be determined. But I think my important point is, rather than getting into specifics, because then someone will say, how soon is this to happen? I think that the key point is there needs to be, you approach these discussions, approach the whole topic with a generosity of spirit. And clever people and will be able to work out specifics. But what's lacking at the moment is, I think, it's sort of a genuine generosity of spirit from both the major traditions in the advancement of their own case, whether it's for a united Ireland or whether it's for a Northern Ireland that remains within the United Kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And my great friend Trevor Ringland used to say about, pride. He's passionately proud about the place he wants to, where he lives, and passionately proud to represent Northern Ireland on the world stage. He said, we're the best people in the world when you push the right buttons. You push the wrong buttons, as our history have shown us, you get, different sort of circumstances. And I think there's a lot of people, and I've seen, a lot of young people in Northern Ireland, and groups like Connected Citizens, and which is trying to bring people together from different backgrounds, speaking out in this generosity of spirit, not just being an echo chamber of people talking to themselves and saying the same things without any compromise. But we need leadership. We need civic leadership. We need political leadership. We need people who are prepared to, to reach out and, approach this with, or come back to the topic with a generosity of spirit. And then you push the real buttons and the right buttons. And there isn't a better place or piece of, in the world when Northern Ireland, or the North, people who label it such, as, can work at its best.
That's a neat segue to the last little question that I can't help myself from asking, right? You
Sure.
spoke with great passion about your illustrious career as a international rugby star, and Professor Biagini touched on this as well. I have often wondered about rugby and the Ireland team, how it's uniquely popular in the way that you described. And I haven't really decided why that is. Is it just because they're very good? Is it because there's something specific about rugby and about the culture of rugby clubs, or is it just fluke or happenstance? Do you think there's something specific that makes kind of rugby this uniquely successful venture? And do we need a peace international for today?
Well, I think in rugby, what is the history? It's a long history. I don't know exactly, but it's well over 100 years been played on the island, and everything that has that longevity builds up a tradition and a richness. I think the fact that it brought people from all parts of the island together, with clubs traveling north, traveling west, east and west, and that sort of brought a sort of build of relationships, which was fantastic. I think also that we love things that we do well in rugby. It's a world sport, but it's played by relatively, small amount of countries. And the fact that we've been able to be successful and compete on the world stage and win Grand Slams and win championships is very important. And it's been magical, to me. Going north was, and people coming south, it was just such a brilliant way, because it brought people to engage together without threatening anybody's identity, without threatening anybody's constitutional position. And anyone who's been to the north of Ireland, been to Northern Ireland, it's a beautiful place. It's filled with fantastic people when you push the right buttons. And it was such a privilege for me to spend so much time. Anytime, it goes back to the other question of if you're invited to something, should you, anytime I was invited to go north, to speak at dinners, to play games, you always did. And you always came back. I always came back having learned something, always came back saying that was a good experience. And I just wish more people, from the Republic could travel north and spend more time there and get to know the place. I don't want to be sort of come across as simplistic or Pollyanna-ish or something, but on a simple basis, as Micheál Martin said correctly, like getting to know people as people means you can maybe make much greater progress on political and other issues.
Absolutely. And being Irish abroad, like you have as well, it's always a unique experience, like a really lovely experience to cheer the national team with people from across the island in a way that you can rarely experience. Okay, we have a bunch of questions, and as always, I'm going to get through as many as I can. I've tried to group them thematically as always, Hugo, but there will be a degree of jumping around, right? Sure. So finger on the buzzer.
Sure. The
first question I'm going to put to you comes from our colleague, Professor Tain Tanham at Trinity College, Dublin. And I'll read it at length. It's not terribly long, but I'll read it word for word. Tain asks, how do we approach the issue of those young people and others in the Republic of Ireland who seem to have become more anti-British and more nationalistic in a narrow sense in the past 10 years and either don't realise or don't care about respect for British identity? It's too late to get back. Sorry, is it too late to get back to generosity of spirit? One characteristic, not pulling any punches there. Hugo.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And Tain is a very shrewd sort of commentator on sort of trends. I suppose it was sort of reflected. I don't know if it's reflected in the deterioration of relationships at government level and sort of the caricaturing of people, whereas, you know, our political leaders got criticized in the UK press, whether it's through Brexit, and so there was a personalization of relationships, and maybe that's reflected, you know, in the Republic, or with, you know, with views for personalities who are actually leadership. Because I think it's Brexit as really, in a sense, and the polarized positions. Because I was going back to what I mentioned earlier. It used to be after the, you know, a few years ago, before Brexit came to the fore, and following the sort of the respective visits of the Queen and the President, you, like, literally, and I know I'm repeating what I meant earlier, but I think it bears repetition. You just couldn't go to an event without people saying how great relationships were between Britain and Ireland, and they were great. And you know, just unfortunate. This is what we've got to get back to, because we've got so much in common. We've got so much in terms of mutual interest. But at this, you know, when you just look at, you know, I suppose when young people see, you know, the sort of the politician or politicians taking very strong views against what they perceive as against their country, then this can play out. Because I'm trying to think about it sort of broader, out of a political, it's like, is there been a social, is there any particular thing about the growth of social media, or the growth, or particular factors that, in addition to the Brexit, that has you know, caused this kind of negative view that Attain has picked up? I think I know I haven't really answered your question. I'm actually fascinated by the question, and I'll think further on it. But I think would just, you know, offer briefly those comments about, I think it's the political leaders that are being targeted by both countries.
No, certainly. I mean, I think the nature of leadership now and the nature of leadership leading up to 98 and even the decades before were just in such a different context. I think it's always interesting to reflect on that.
Absolutely.
Hugo, the next question I'll put to you is from an attendee, Colin Williams. And Colin asks, how do NGOs, non-governmentals, get their narratives of reconciliation onto the platforms of political parties without them being corrupted for expedient reasons rather than genuine civic ones? Another tough question.
Great question. Great question. I've been involved since, you know, as I say, since I was in college. I've been involved with Cooperation Ireland or Ireland Funds, BIA, whatever. I think you just have to, there are good things, and, you know, and citizens' assemblies, provided they work, provided they're real citizens' assemblies. I mean, I think that's, you know, in a sense, but they've got to sort of capture a voice. The political parties have to, I suppose, think that it's worth listening to. I don't really have, I think it's a great question. I don't really have, even having been involved in a number of organizations, and you get feedback for involvements, or whether it was in the Ireland Funds, it was helping specific projects or integrated education or whatever. And the BIA, you know, we brought together political leaders at our last conference. I just think you just have to keep trying. But I think it's very interesting. It's what the polls, and I think it's going to be very interesting, particularly in Northern Ireland. I mean, the sort of growth of the centre ground, or is there going to be the sort of the growth of the centre ground reflected the next time we have elections? But it's a very good question. I don't really have I'm afraid. I see the benefit of all these groups, and having been involved with them, and, you know, developing ones like the Connected Citizens Initiative, and the One Young World. The One Young World coming to Belfast was a fascinating. That is a phenomenon for anyone who's not familiar with that. It's in, you know, Google it and see where it's been over the last number of years. And they had it in Dublin a number of years ago, and it was really powerful. You had people from all over the world, like literally, in addition to the Olympics, it was the only event that people from every country in the world came, and they're going to come to Belfast now. And I think it's, and you know, again, it bears repeating that the reason Belfast was chosen was for its history, for its resilience, that the humor of the people, the welcome of the people, that all the people who were making the judging felt when they came. And it goes back with my friend Trevor Ringland, who said, it's pushing those right buttons, and not the wrong ones. Push the right buttons and you get, you know, very good outcomes. I'm not being simplistic about that, because it's complicated. You know, there's complicated and very real issues, but I genuinely believe, and having based on my own experience, that personal involvement and the personal reaching out is very important.
absolutely. I'd echo that Belfast is a cool European city for anyone who hasn't visited. It's a great place. And if you didn't log in, that our last meeting with Claire Hanna MP and Nicholas Allen, which was last week, is available on our website. It was like being transported to Belfast for an hour because the pair of them were speaking with great kind of fluency and experience of that home place. So, Colin, if you have any answers to your question, actually, do please pop them into the chat because it is a real humdinger, and I think Hugo did very well to try and answer a tough question. Hugo, a good kind of jumping off point then from Pierce Dargan. I hope I got your name right, Pierce. And we've already spoken a bit about kind of rugby. Rugby is obviously deeply associated with schools. Pierce asks a perennial question. Do you believe the continued segregation of schools along religious lines in both the South and the North hinder increased reconciliation, in your view?
Yeah, I think for the North, the South, if I just park the sort of the South, but I think, yeah, integrated, there's got to be greater. I mean, it's a bit simple. I know it's complicated and I know it's challenging and I know, but the simple fact is that if you bring up people as separate and, you know, emphasize the separateness of them from an early age and probably one of the most formative periods in their lives, how can you expect it not to have a consequence? And, you know, and a lot of very good people have worked in the integrated education. I think of Ernest May Blood and, you know, in Belfast, it just has to be, we have to do better. We have to do better on this. It's a bit like, again, providing a lot of marginalized working class Protestant communities. Don't be surprised if people, you know, react in certain ways. I'm not excusing anyway, but there's you know, there's complicated, tough issues, but we've got to do better than, you know, I don't know, maybe it's 7-8% of young people in a very polarized part of the world actually being educated together. We have to do better than that.
Absolutely. And it's important to kind of point out it's North and South as well.
Yeah.
So I'll move on to it. I'd say we'll get through maybe 3 more questions, Hugo, and we'll leave everyone to their evening. I'll give you a chance to sum up as well in case you've anything you want to respond to, and also in case Professor Biagini has some remarks. But there's a question from Brian Donaldson, and I'm going to kind of edit it as I look. Brian points out that the Good Friday Agreement, Strand 1, Part 35 to be specific, states the need for a civic platform, and he points out how it began and then fell with Stormont and was never reinstated. Brian identifies himself with the group, the NI Civic Voice, who are kind of driving the idea of reinstating a civic platform. Do you have a view on that? Do you think this would be a good thing? Do you have anything to say to Brian regarding the future of a civic voice on the island of Ireland in the form of a civic platform?
Yeah, absolutely. The more vehicles, as I mentioned in the talk, of making them work with is got to be the way forward, especially in a very divided place. And if what Brian means is bringing people together, you know, in a generosity of spirit, is to look and see how it can make progress. Absolutely. I mean, you always want to make sure you haven't got dilution or too many entities trying to do exactly the same thing. But as the basic principle, absolutely, because it comes back to, you know, when I start the talk is saying mutual respect, tolerance, and reconciliation are important. Are they soft topics? How do you make them hard? Is if you have actual entities that are promoting them. So, you know, absolutely, I would, you know, encourage you and make it as open and embracive, not being, you know, sort of an echo chamber of people who are all the same and saying the same thing and pursuing the same objective. You need to be open and amenable to change and discussion.
You have such experience of, for example, the British Irish Association, which for me it's a phenomenally interesting organization. I've been really enthusiastic since my rather recent involvement in it. From that experience, Hugo, is there anything, like, to use a jaded cliche, out of the box thinking, any ideas that you think such a civic group, civic platform could tackle that people aren't talking about, or anything you suggest?
The reason for your, thank you for your kind remarks, and for those who are not familiar, many people on your audience were not familiar, the British Irish Association is something that was set up, an organization that was set up in the 70s at the height of the Troubles to provide a safe space for people to meet who wouldn't meet elsewhere. And that was in Oxford or Cambridge colleges. And many people were caught up in the troubles at the time. And it sort of has continued since then as being a forum to bring people together to have difficult discussions. Now, people can meet in other places that they couldn't meet back then. But certainly, even in our most recent sort of conference, in having, the Taoiseach and Simon Coveney, Pascal Donoghue, Michael Gove, Lord Frost, Brandon Lewis, and all these people who are working with them was very powerful. So the more, and these are not meeting in other places, at the moment with Brexit. Part of the problem is that British and Irish public officials working in the departments are not meeting. So I having seen the benefits, or having been, more importantly, having been told of the benefits by the people who have participated in those conferences or in those gatherings, how worthwhile that they find them. I would be encouraging of that as being as broad as it can, with groups and bodies, making sure you have a clear purpose, making sure you're not trying to do too many things, make sure you're not getting mission creep, meaning getting into areas outside your competence, but anything that is practically, that puts the practical, or makes the concept of reconciliation and mutual understanding less soft and more tangible and hard. And what do we do about it? And how do we get results? And how do we influence people? I would advocate, especially at the situation at the moment where things are so fraught in terms of the key relationships across these islands and between these islands that I mentioned before.
Fantastic. I'm going to put a concluding question to you from Nigel Carr, but just I'll mention one honourable mention that Niall Coleman has asked. I think, I'm not sure if it's a rhetorical question or not, but he's asking if you would respectfully march at an orange parade. I think what Niall is talking about is to try and celebrate each other's cultures, and whether you have anything to say about that, not but kind of to support an orange parade. And the concluding question from Nigel Carr, if I may, I'll read out at length as well. Nigel asks, if generosity of spirit is the key, how long do you think it will be until we see this from the political leaders in the respective jurisdictions? And then this touches on some of the stuff you said, Hugo. How could this be accelerated? Is it integrated education? Is it Commonwealth membership? Is it making rugby compulsory for all, smiley face? I think that was a bit of levity. But genuinely, you've mentioned so many things. So perhaps you've really kind of, you've been extremely honest with us, and I think you've laid a lot out for us. But is there anything else you think that could accelerate this, that Nigel Carr asks about?
Yeah, dealing with the Orange Parade. Yeah, I was up in
you were.
Not last year, but I was I was invited, friends, to go to the main Orange Parade in Belfast. There was Tourism Ireland, or we're having a breakfast nearby. Howard Hastings was involved in a lot of things in Northern Ireland, invited me to come up, and we went to the parade. It was great. Yeah, it was. I would go to, anytime I've been invited to Northern Ireland, whether from different backgrounds, different traditions, things that are important to the different traditions and identities, and something that isn't meant to be adversarial or threatening. I've gone, and I've always gone over my life. I can't remember if you said going to Northern Ireland one time and on my way back saying that was a waste of time, or I wish I hadn't gone there. Quite the opposite, because I have just such fantastic memories and experiences. And yeah, Nigel, who's a great friend of mine, has gone and a former Irish Rugby International as well, who got caught up in a sort of a bomb, an IRA bombing, which ended his career. I hope you won't mind me saying it, but Nigel's always been a sort of a voice of reason and a voice of rationale that, I think, how do we accelerate it? I think it's on as many fronts as we can, Nigel, and and asking the question. It's almost, this is a kind of question you ask your politicians. What are you doing in respect of advancing reconciliation? What do you do? Because until there's a consequence, as you pointed out in an earlier question, then it may only get embedded so much. But there is good, I would make sure, the political bodies that have been set up to make them work and make them, give them real power, and the private citizens or the citizens' assemblies, I think, are very important as well. And it comes down to, I think, the people in Northern Ireland, speaking out and getting behind the things that are going to move them forward, with respecting everybody's identity and sense of belonging. I think there's huge potential, which is why I, concluded my remarks by saying it's a huge prize, but it's a prize worth going for.
Phenomenal. So both Niall got an answer to his question, and I've become acquainted with Nigel Carr. It's a pleasure, and thanks for sharing Niall's story, Hugo. Hugo, I'm going to invite you to wrap up now, and I'm going to mention 2 or 3 things, if I may. That I really enjoyed your intervention, and as I said, the kind of honesty and clarity with which you've tackled their questions. To those whose the questions we didn't ask, forgive us, we will share them with Hugo. I'd be interested, something we've spoken about offline, Hugo, if you could just reflect a little bit on leadership. We've spoken so much about the kind of the aspirations you have for making our home places better, for making the island of Ireland a great place to live for everybody. But if you have anything positive or negative to say about the kind of the role of leadership in that, political and other, compared to previous decades. You've mentioned the kind of the sleeping giant of English nationalism. I'm not going to push you on that because you don't have time, but I think that was a kind of a really interesting anecdote you shared with us. And I do wonder whether everything we're talking about, when it kind of meets the kind of the reality of the ongoing Brexit psychodrama, whether we're really kind of speaking about the right things, whether Brexit is actually going to eclipse everything we're speaking about. By all means, please comment if you've anything to say, but I don't expect you to fix that problem. And then finally, we always like to hear from speakers, whether if you could comment on, do you anticipate seeing United Ireland in your lifetime? You don't have to say whether you prefer it or not, but do you anticipate it? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Well, in answer to those 3 very easy and very simple questions, look, I think leadership is critically important. We see that in everyday life. The most successful Irish rugby teams I played in had great captains, great leaders, people who were authentic, who were genuine, who thought of everybody within the team, who wasn't in there for their own personal advancement, but was in it for the advancement of the team and the country, and and playing with the national team. It's so important. And we rightly eulogize the sort of great leaders like John Hume, like Seamus Mallon, and I don't want to just say it's from the nationalist side, but people who really reached out and reached across, boundaries and borders, and a lot of there's been good leaders in unionism as well. But that going forward, it's so important, and we need. I use the phrase consistently reaching out. In this tricky situation and time that we find ourselves, is this a consistent generosity of spirit. The English, I think the second point, Brexit is tough, and Brexit's having a lot of damage, and Brexit looks like it could go on having damage in relationship. And I think that kind of, the sleep, English nationalism is a big factor, and it's a factor not just in Northern Ireland, but it has actually, unfortunately, ebbed away or undermined the sort of in some ways, the support. It's made unionist people very nervous, more nervous. And what's going to happen in Scotland? Are we going to have a referendum? When I made the comments, I was very surprised when my friends from the Welsh office had said that those kind of were the sort of figures that they were hearing in terms of. So the whole question of the United Kingdom is changing, and where that's going to end up, I don't think any of us can kind of predict. On the final story of United Ireland, I go back to the point. I think there's 2 big issues. One is finding a Northern Ireland that's genuinely reconciled between the major traditions. I think that's a huge prize to go for. I also think it's a prerequisite for this. And if we got to the stage, and then the second point was there going to be a United Ireland or a change? I'm not dodging the second, but I think if we had made a lot of progress on the first, I think you'll have much more fruitful conversations around the second. But I think that the danger is, and I would respectfully say that a lot of people are just jumping to the second point because that's more sexy, because that's more interesting than tolerance and reconciliation, border polls, and what are the trends, and most likely who'll do well, who'll do badly. That's a kind of sexier thing. But I think it's a bit like the analogy that I made of the person who wants to win the Olympic medal. If you don't do the training, if you don't do the hard work, if you don't do the boring, long, late nights and training in the winter, the equivalent of that in terms of building relationships, in terms of building dialogue, including trust, understanding the position of the other, celebrating the other's culture and not trying to frustrate it. But if you don't do that, then I think jumping onto the second point is dangerous. I don't want to be alarmist. I'm not going to go down that route. But I would finish by saying the first part is where we should be focused, and then everything is possible for all traditions.
Ask an international rugby player about leadership, and you get a great answer. Thanks, Hugo. It's been a real pleasure. I want to thank you for your honesty and clarity and candor, and also for all the questioners. As always, it feels a bit like a tough Cambridge supervision from the caliber of questions we get, but you did extremely well, and we really appreciate your time, but also your great contribution to British-Irish relations over the decades. So I want to thank you for that. It's done from me. I'm going to invite Professor Biagini just to close the session, but to remind you all, we will be hosting Bertie Ahern next week and Eileen Weir from the Shankill Women's Centre the following week. I hope many of you can join us then. For me, thank you very much and good night.
Thank you again. And once again, I think this webinar has shown the importance of listening to people, comparing different positions, thinking about challenges ahead, and thinking of how much has been achieved over the past 20 or 30 years and how much could be achieved if only we can recover this generosity of spirit about which Hugo was speaking so eloquently. So thank you to all the participants, and thank you, Barry, and indeed especially thank you, Hugo. Good night.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Barry. Thanks, Eugenio.